Buonasera a tutti e benvenuti a questa nuova puntata del The Flywheel Show. Questa sera abbiamo un ospite particolare con noi, c'è Jason Gonzalez. Gonzo. May I call you Gonzo, Jason Gonzalez? How do you prefer?
Gonzo, please.
Gonzo is okay.
Yeah.
Gonzo è l'autore della Mano del Destino, un nuovo romanzo grafico che uscirà per Leviathan Labs la settimana prossima e che in America è stato pubblicato da Image Comics. So, Gonzo,
Yes.
welcome here. Welcome at the Flywheel Show. It's a pleasure to stay with you. And I was saying that The Hand of Destiny will be published in Italy by Leviathan Labs next week. Actually, it's the 10th
Yes.
of October. So it's a long road. It's very interesting to see how the Italian public will enjoy your pages, because I've read it during the last days and I found it very, very enjoyable. So first of all, congratulations for your books, because it's very, very interesting.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been a while. It's been a long road. Yeah.
So one of the first things that I read that was very, very interesting in your book is that the luchador are wearing a mask not to hide their identity, but to show their true self. It's quite interesting. Would you like to detail a little more about that?
Well, I think culturally, there's a it's weird. It's weird explaining this to Italians and like Americans. So culturally, Mexicans, which I'm so Chicano, like I'm a Chicano, like of Mexican descent, but we were all, I grew up in America, in the United States, but very much, I was just in the part of the country that became America that used to be Mexico. So, but Mexico has a tumultuous relationship with like inherent identity, right? So like, because we all, like we were a conquered nation, right? Like the Spanish were there for, a few hundred years, several hundred years. Most of us have some amount of Spanish, but also some amount of indigenous lineage, right? Like, so we're as much conquistador as we are conquered, like we're as much victim as we are kind of victimizer. And so we have a hard time kind of leaning into any kind of inherent identity. Like you can't really be, because you're equal sides, or you're part, one and the other. So it's hard to say, like, the American kind of hero is very ego driven. He he's like destined to be the hero. He's like born to be this thing. But like in Mexico, we have a long tradition of heroes who forsake their birthright to become other things, take things like Zorro or something like that, right? Like, the guy was a nobleman, but he helps people out. And so I think that even though masked wrestling had existed before it became Mexican wrestling, it was an ethos that really really resonated with us as a people, right? So like you take this person who obliterates their ego, he completely obscures like how handsome he is or what he looks like, and there's a lot of respectability politics with how dark you are versus how pale you are, like how European versus how indigenous you look. That all gets obscured. He becomes this symbol that is his mask, and then he takes that into the ring, and it's a thing that he wagers every time he steps in the ring, because he can lose that. And as per the rules of Lucha Libre, if you lose that identity, if you lose the mask, you never get to be that person again. So every win, every loss, every belt, every fan is attached to the mask, and he walks in, and it's only laced to his face, like it's only tied in the back, like, and he risks that. And I think that like the idea of constructing an identity through action and not through inherent identity, resonates well with like me culture, like us culturally, like with Mexicans culturally, and I think it's a sentiment that is very foreign to a lot of cultures that seems very intriguing, but it is just an affect of having, the place in the world that we, that is Mexico, like that kind of history that it has, of not really being able to latch on to like an inherent identity and really defining yourself through deeds and actions. It's what you do and not who you are. And I think that gets distilled down into the luchador, and the kind of stakes of that, of just taking everything that you are and risking it every time that you step into the ring, is a machismo that we can get behind. Like it's like, I'm not just going to wager my belt. I'm not just going to wager my title. This isn't just be a win or loss. I'm going to wager my identity every time I step into the ring. And I think that those stakes kind of resonate with culturally with who Mexicans are as a people, who we are as a people. And so, and it's part of the kind of pageantry of Lucha Libre. It's what makes it so great. There's no Clark Kent to the Superman. It's just the Superman. Like we've forgone the secret identity, and just that guy goes away, and it's all just it's all just what you do and not who you are. So that's my long-winded way of saying that.
That says is related to the kayfabe.
Yes,
the fact
exactly.
that
Yeah,
there is a fiction that is even outside of the ring. There is
yeah,
it's not like the American wrestling, which you know that
yeah.
characters are characters and people are people.
Yeah,
So
there's a suspension of disbelief that happens with American wrestling like that, which, wrestling as performance art as opposed to an athletic endeavor, is an invitation to the audience to participate with it. And then Mexican wrestling says, let's take that performance art and push it out into the world. Like let's take it beyond the ring. And I think that because all identity is a construct. And so just to push that outside the ring is just to kind of point a finger at like, oh yeah, it's all made up. Like, you with your business suit pretending to be a businessman and be important is as ridiculous as me with a mask and trunks on saying that I'm I'm the son of a demon or whatever. Like they're just as ridiculous notions, and they're just as just agreed upon. It's all just consent. It's just because in context, the guy in a business suit walks into an office and the people around him treat him with the respect that is commensurate with being a businessman. The guy with the wrestling mask on walks into a wrestling ring and he's treated with the respect. It's all a construct. So it's an invitation to extend the performance art beyond that, and it also points a spotlight at the ridiculousness of identity to begin with.
no, it's interesting. You're right. We are all playing in some measures a fictional story about ourselves. It's true.
Exactly.
It is interesting because I mean, with in the figure of the wrestler, of the luchador, there is the traditional myth of mythology from, I mean, a Western point of view. There is the tradition from ancient pre-Columbian America, and from also superheroes from Silver Ages. So how did you put all these things together?
I just it kind of just dawned. I mean, it just felt right, I guess, more than anything. Like I love the kind of traditions of Mesoamerican mythology and the Mesoamerican, ethos, I guess. The tradition of masked warriors in Mesoamerica, from the Toltecs to the Olmecs to the Aztecs. They all have this, where they embody the things that, again, it's like, you put on the mask of a jaguar to become a jaguar warrior. People start treating you like a jaguar warrior. You feel like a jaguar warrior. You know what I mean? It's like, it's this kind of positive, like, reinforcement feedback that happens. And I think that, I think it's a long lineage that, I stated in the book. It leads to the luchador. It's like, we're a people who are in the business of people putting on masks and then treating them like their mask. And then they become the embodiment of their mask. I think I just highlighted it. I don't think it's anything I made up or discovered, or it's nothing really new. It's just, I just pointed it out that, like, these are the end point of a long lineage of Mesoamerican masked warriors that extends well beyond, Hernan Cortez and the Spanish getting there. I mean, it goes back to all traditions, the Incas and the Mayans and, people who predate even the Aztecs. So, I didn't really, I just kind of like leaned into it more than I like made anything up, because it was there already.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Now, also in your writing routines, I was interested because I found very, very interesting the fighting scenes, because the white space, the space that there is between one window and the other is the moment in which something happens in a comic book. But in reality, the choreography that you are drawing are very, very interesting because they're very complex, and made me think that you really have a follower, a fan of wrestling. But when you were writing these scenes, how did you do? You just drew it, or you prepared a script scene after scene to think about how you were performing?
When I work kind of Marvel method with myself. So I have like a loose outline and then I start drawing, but I thumbnail everything first. So I do tiny little, little tiny small drawings and I put all 22 on the same sheet of paper so I can see the kind of pace of the entire comic book. And when it comes to fight scenes, like, I'll make little notes on there. And when it comes to the fight scenes, I'll generally will just write like fight across like 4 or 5 pages. Like, fight has to happen here, knowing, like how I want, and I think all good wrestling, professional wrestling tells a story through the wrestling, right? There's always like stakes, and there's always like someone's up and then they're down and they look like they're going to lose, but then they win. And there's always like, subversion of expectation, all of these things. Like, there's a lot of like kind of tricks to American wrestling. So I would just, in preparing for them, I would just write the word like fight, and I would know I had to pull a fight off. And then when it came time to draw it, I would literally choreograph them, where I would like, either take like little action figures that I had, or I would just kind of like stage them in my mind. Because I don't know how wrestling fans are in Europe, but in America, they're very specific. And if you get it wrong, you're going to hear about it. Yeah. So So if you screw it up, like, they're going to get all over you. We're like, he wouldn't, and that couldn't. And I've been around enough wrestling fans and enough comic book fans to know that they're going to push their glasses up and actually me and tell me what was wrong with it. So I knew that it had to be right, or as right as I could make it. I had to take care. And to me, the whole impetus for making the book was every time you see Mexican wrestling in a movie or in any other medium that's not the ring itself, they get it wrong. Like, they just kind of like, they're just not quite right about like how they do the things. They don't shoot it like wrestling. It doesn't look like a wrestling match. And especially Lucha Libre always kind of gets treated like a punchline in American movies. So I really wanted to treat the wrestling with respect. And I really wanted to have a caring, deft hand at assembling it in a way that would be visually compelling, but still structurally correct to the strictures of professional wrestling. So I literally was like, okay, they're going to start, there's going to be the initial lockup, right? And then where do we go from there? Like, oh, he's going to, probably get around on him, or he's going to try to get him in a half Nelson and he can reverse that. And like, I just made sure that we don't really, unless it's a montage, because I do a couple of montages, we never really go from one position to another without there being some obvious way on how that happened. And I just wanted to make sure that it flowed that way, because I knew I was going to hear it from wrestling, because I'm doing a wrestling comic book. The story is about wrestling. Wrestling fans are going to read it. And if I get it wrong, I'm going to hear about it. And I just didn't want to hear about it. So I literally, a lot of staging, like external, like, I figure the moves out either with action figures or just in my mind. And then I would think, like, what's an interesting camera angle on that? How can I show that? And then how do I make it clear to the reader that he went from the top of the rope to on top of him, or he did a backflip over him, or whatever the move was. I wanted to make sure that it was clear enough in the reader's mind that that was what was happening. I didn't want it just to always be collages of wrestling moves. Like, part of the difference between American wrestling and Lucha Libre is American wrestling is very kind of, again, it's ego driven. It's about imposition of will and power and strength. Lucha Libre is very dynamic and leverage and agility. And I wanted to capture that aspect of it. And so I can't just have every guy doing a backflip in every panel. Like, I needed it to have a flow to it, because part of the impressiveness of Lucha Libre is that flow of moves. It's the agility that one moves into leads into another. And there's a lot of series, like, they're into the ring, they're out of the ring, he's on the rope, he's on top of him. Like, all that flow is what makes it so compelling. And so I just needed to put that on the page to both make it move and also get it right. That was kind of how I did all of that.
Well, I guess that the fans, the wrestler fans, are even more demanding than the comic book fans. So
yes, for sure,
you are in a really troubled line, because you have both of them on your side. So
yeah, absolutely, yeah, exactly. And you're gonna hear, if you screw it up, you're gonna hear about it from everybody. Yeah. So, and I just didn't want to hear it.
No. I have read it. It's very, very interesting, and also I found very interesting in the way you created the backstory for all of the main characters. Of course, there is an interesting backstory for the End of Destiny, which is the main character, but also El Jefe, Calavera, and all the other characters have interesting plot behind them. So, being a complete author like you talked about all these things before starting to writing and drawing. So you made a script, or you just start drawing with your story in your mind?
So I at some point I started scripting it, and it was more of an outline than a script. But it started off as just 8 pages of a story I was doing, and I did those 8 pages as a portfolio piece. And I really just wanted to get from I kind of had an idea about what the story could be, like, this kind of like, it's a Faustian bargain. It's a deal with the devil. You make a deal to get your revenge, and then you're like, oh no, I made a deal with the devil. It sucks. I got to get out of it, right? But I wanted to put it all in the context of like 1960s Lucha Libre, and I wanted the world to be a world in which Lucha Libre was the most important thing in that world. And so I did the 8 pages. I think where did I get to? I might have gotten up to where Gigi shows up in his bathroom. I think that's where I got to on those pages. So I think that might be like 10 or 11 pages maybe at some point. Yeah. And I just showed him off to get other work. Like, I had left working for, I worked for Todd McFarlane. I'd left there, and I was just trying to get other work. And I had other samples in there, but without fail, every editor I talked to was like, what is this? I'm like, oh, it's just a dumb wrestling story that I'm doing. So much so that then Dark Horse Comics was very interested in doing it. And they're like, hey, we'll do this whole issue, and we'll make a decision based on the entire issue. So then I was like, oh, now I got to now I have to figure, like, I knew the story I kind of wanted to tell. I knew it was going to be about brothers. I knew it was going to be about identity versus destiny. I knew it was going to happen in the 60s, but I hadn't really thought about how I was going to break it up into issues. So then I sat down and was like, okay, I'll do it. I had to propose it. So I'm like, I'll propose it as a 6-issue series. This is what each chapter needs to be. This is where this chapter needs to end. And then, that first issue, I kind of just had done those initial pages and then knew where it needed to end, from Gigi walking into the bathroom to, to where it ends in the, him, at the end of that match, like setting it up where it's like, oh, now I know I need to take out all these people on my way to the big boss. And so that one was a little more by the seat of my pants, but then I kind of had enough room for the other 5 issues to go, oh, these are what those need to be. But then I got to issue 6 and I was like, oh man, like I really should make this something special. Like, oh, I should just do a double size issue. Like old comics, like occasionally you just get a double size issue. So I was like, oh, I'll do a double size, which is just a dumb idea. Because when you're on page 36 of a 44-page comic and you realize you could have been done 14 pages ago, it's a hard sell. You're like, oh man, I should have just made this 22 issues and I would have finished. But to me, it's like, it allowed me to wrap everything up, and it allowed me to kind of add a little more backstory in there, and not just as opposed to like there being any weird exposition. And then originally, I think I had some moments in there that were going to be like a panel or, just maybe a single page. And I got to like really, like I got to draw that big 4-page section where he talks to Quetzalcoatl. Like I got to do that, really big and kind of cartoony, as opposed to just having it be this like single page that I had originally planned it out to be. And so there was like a loose scaffolding of an idea about like kind of signposts, like this needs to happen, that needs to happen. But then like I'll outline an issue and it's on a single page. It's just like these 3 pages, he's going to talk to Gigi for a little bit. These 5 pages are going to be him, his backstory. These 6 pages are going to be this part of the backstory that, and then I get in there. I'm like, okay, well, I want this moment and this moment and that moment to be in there. And then I put in like a few bullet points of like moments I want to be in there. And then I just go straight to thumbnailing. And then I'm like, okay, like here's my script, and then I'll look at my 22 pages and like, okay, well, these 3 pages are this going to be this, so it has to start here and there, and then I kind of fiddle in some like boxes, and it just all like it's all for me. It's like setting like this, and then I start going like, okay, here's these things in between, and then I go take that section, I move it over here. I'm like, okay, now I know I ended here, and then this has to happen, and then I fill in these spaces. Yeah, so it's like filling in black on a large area where you're drawing in. It's like I'll put the outline on there. And then I just start chunking away little sections of black until eventually it all fills itself in. So it's very because when I'm writing, I'm very loose and kind of like I know I want this scene, so I'll jump to that scene, and I know I want this scene, I'll jump to that scene. I realize some stuff has to happen in between there, and I'll write a little bit out there, like fill in kind of some of the gaps. I'll go back and forth. But when I start penciling the book, I start on page 1, upper left-hand corner, and I work to the bottom right-hand corner. Then I move on to page 2, 3, 4, etc. Pencil the entire book. Then I go back to page 1 and I ink page 1, upper left-hand corner, work my way to the bottom until I do the entire book. And then when I color everything. So I do that very, when I'm working on the art part of it, it's like very in order. Pencils, inks, color, letter, finishes, and then in that order, and then I go to like lay out the book and I put it all in InDesign. But when I'm writing, I'm like, oh, page 1, page 19, page 15, page 17. Yeah. So by the time I get to the drawing, I've got such a clear-cut map that I can just start, and when I do the thumbnails, I jump around too. So when it comes to the actual draftsmanship, like I'm going to put pencil on paper, this is going to be the art that goes in the book. Then I've drawn it, like I wrote it, I've thumbnailed it, I've organized it. Now I just need to follow my map, and I can start here and work my way there. And so that's kind of, again, it's like it's interesting being a one-man show. It's like I can work that way. Like I can be kind of loose in Marvel method.
Of course.
But then also being a flaky artist, I need to, like, when it comes time to doing the grind, I need to not just be working on the pages that I love and then like, oh shit, now I've got to draw that, conversation page, or I've got to draw that, like, big exterior arena shot or whatever it is. Like I'm very disciplined, or I try to be as disciplined as I can with the actual draftsmanship part of it. But with the construction of it, I can be a little more like, oh, I'll just kind of figure these out. And then I do also leave like work for myself where I'm like, all right, just fight. Like, and then I have to like, okay, now I have to draw a fight. So
you worked on with paper or in digital?
Both actually. So I pencil everything by hand onto art, like onto Bristol board. So pencil on board, first draft is penciled onto actual Actually, what I do normally do is I will draw. I'll rule out my page, and then I will draw all of my boxes. Like I'll draw all my panels in there, and then I will trace put a piece of tracing paper over that, and then I will lightly block in like a breakdown of like what like the people are going to be and kind of like backgrounds and stuff. And then if I need to adjust stuff, I can just shift the tracing paper as need be. I sometimes will cut that piece of tracing paper up and like move stuff, or like I need to be the other way so I can flip it around. But I'll do all my breakdowns on tracing paper, and then I light box that onto my Bristol, and then I pencil everything on Bristol. Then I scan everything into the computer, and then I ink everything in ink and color and letter everything in Illustrator. So it's all vector art, and it's all the pen tool with either custom brushes or it's all pen tool and a mouse. Like I don't have a Cintiq. Like I just ink everything like click 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 as I'm making like lines on a paper. It's all Bezier curves and line work. And I keep all of my blacks on one layer and then all my colors on a layer behind that. And then I pull all of that into a Photoshop document that has like scanned in like old paper. It's got like distressed plates where I can like distress the ink and then have it multiply off of the paper, and then the layer above that, and then the layer above that. And so I basically, to make it look like an old comic book, because the comic happens in the 60s, I want it to like look and feel and smell like an old comic book. So I basically do the really bad printing process that would be done in the 60s. I would do that digitally, and then take that, then give that to like a nice, nice crispy new digital printer here to like print that out, which is funny because initially they're like, oh man, like this is screwed up. Like the plates are picking and the blacks aren't 100%. Like we've checked. I'm like, no, that's how I wanted it to look. Like I go out of my way. It takes more work to make a comic look crappy and old than it does to like make it look crisp and new these days. So, but yeah, I mean, I wanted it to be like this kind of artifact of a time that never really happened. But like, it's in the 60s, so it's kind of the 60s. So the art style itself, the methods that I use are all things that you could have done in like 1965. So I don't employ any like no blends, no feathered edges, no gradients. Like it's all like I was cutting film back in the day, or so because of that, it lends itself well to being done in like Illustrator. So and it's also like my go-to tool anyway. So it's a little, it starts by hand, and then sometimes like sound effects, like I'll do those straight up by hand and like ink those even by hand. I'll scan those in and then put them in the Photoshop document and like adjust them accordingly. Some like lettering or some background elements, like I'll ink by hand and scan in and then add those in. But yeah, I'm about like, I don't know, probably about 30%, by hand, and then 70%, ends up being done on the computer. But I've done work where I've just inked everything by hand as well. I started this one this way, so I ended up having to do all 6 issues this way.
But it's good because you're able to mix up technology from the past with the modern technology. So it's a mix. It's always a good when you're able to put these different things together.
Yeah.
And speaking about your drawing style, I was very impressed because there is a strong feeling about a comic book written and drawn in the 60s. So I've seen, especially in the character design and in the nervous lines of the faces, so much of Jack Kirby.
Oh yeah.
What is your relationship with Silver Age comic books and especially with Jack Kirby?
Oh, I can't hide that it's Jack. Like this is a love letter to Jack Kirby. The entire comic book is my love letter to Jack Kirby. I started reading comics in like the late 70s. I didn't really get into them until like the 80s, but the kind of Marvel house style was very prevalent when I started, and comics just look like that. And to me, that's just what a comic book looks like, and it's I just love those old comics, like, so back issues for me were comics from the 60s and stuff like that. So I could get like old Fantastics for like a nickel or 25 cents or whatever, like they were in the quarter bins. And nowadays it probably cost you a pretty penny, but they were just old comics back then. They were just like, unless there was something important, with a capital I, important, they really weren't worth much. They were like a quarter or less. And I would just, being a kind of a broke kid, I would just go through and like read all these old, old 60s comic books. And then, like my idea of like kind of comic books got formed by that kind of John Romita Senior house style. Like behind me, like see if I can move this way. So behind me, there's this like Spider-Man record I had from when I was a kid, and that's just John Romita Spider-Man is just Spider-Man to me. Like that's what he looks like. And whenever anyone else draws him, I'm like, oh, that's cute that they do that, but it's not really Spider-Man. And so, like I just, my first impressions of it were just of that kind of like tail end of the Bronze Age, but then like diving back into the 60s kind of, Silver Age. And then things like, as I got to be more of a collector, there was more kind of like a black and white explosion happened, and like there was more kind of experimental art forms. Like I excuse me, I bought a lot of the early Kamiko books back in the 80s. It's like the things like the Pander brothers or like Matt Wagner were doing kind of different kind of art styles. But to me, it was like that Kirby look is just what comics should be. And so when it came time to do my own comic, I really to me, the 60s was like the heyday of the luchador. Like, it's like when El Santo was making movies, when Mil Mascaras and Blue Demon were making movies. And so I was like, I want to set this in the 60s because that's like, and it was also a time, it might have been the last time in the world where modernism was really embraced, when we were all about the new and the latest, greatest, like this kind of jet age world where, anything was possible and everything was like the new version of it. And I really love that, like those old lucha libre movies from the 60s that were made in Mexico, everything was super modern. Like the cars they drove, the apartments they were in, the clothes they wore, everything. There was no sense of like ironically retro anything. Like they were just embracing the future in a way that like I don't think we have since. And so I wanted, like, I just want to delve into this kind of like retro futurism, like this idea of futurism that existed 60 years ago, and then also set it in the 60s because that's when the luchadors were like at their prime. And then I thought about like, I'm gonna take like that 60s Marvel house style aesthetic and just apply it to these comic books to make them look and feel like the 60s, and then take that kind of Silver Age, like the way that Stan Lee, the operatic tones of Stan Lee in the 60s, like those over to the top, overwrought purple prose, like that to me is totally synonymous with like the operatic melodrama of the pomp and circumstance of lucha libre, like the pageantry of lucha libre. It just they work so well. But then at some point I realized that like, I can also appropriate the paragon of American white male power fantasy and subvert it into being a commentary on the Chicano diaspora and the Mexican American experience within that country. So I'm taking these superhero tropes and then contextualizing them into a very Latinx kind of feel. And so that kind of like intrigued me too. I'm like, I'm taking the language of white male power fantasy and turning it into this very Mexican story, and that appealed to me as well. So all of those elements kind of came into there, and also I just think they look cool. Like it just looks better than
yeah,
like,
of course.
Yeah,
It's an added bonus, of course.
Yeah.
Going back to your writing style, it was interesting because I mean, at a certain point, there is this pact that the end of destiny is following. This pact is about vengeance, but it's also a way to recover his own identity. But it's also like a popular feeling because his relationship with his audience and the fact that the audience really physically support at a certain point the character is made like a sort of a revolutionary character somehow.
I mean, I wanted him to have an arc, and I knew that for a guy, I think a lot of times people kind of feel like they learned their lesson, right? Like you see like this, rags to riches stories, right? Like it started with nothing and then suddenly like, oh, now they've got all this money, but there's still the potential for them to not get it at that point. Like they can kind of forget where they came from. And I wanted a guy who had, so on a cultural level, I wanted a guy who, Mexico is a place that is very fraught with classism, right? Like, and that goes back to before the Spanish ever got there. Like, the Aztecs had their class system. The Spanish showed up and just put themselves on the top of that class system, and like, and it all still remained, and so like for a long time, and literally until like 80 years ago, maybe 100 years ago at the most, it was very like you were like indio, mestizo, criollo, European, and so I wanted a guy who started at the bottom rung, and he sees and he wants to be at the top. And all he sees are the trappings of being at the top, and he doesn't really understand he only sees a style of success and not the substance of it. And so he gets it all though. Like he gets there. He goes from being in prison, being, at that bottom, being like a hired hand and being kind of a domestic worker, to being the champion. And he's like, and he thinks that, like that's proof of his, of his kind of his proof of his righteousness, right? Like, oh, look, like I was correct because look at where I am, only to find out that like, that's fraught with its own kind of turmoil, right? And to see that it all can get taken away from you instantly. And so outside of all of your success, who are you when everything gets stripped away from you? What remains when your identity can get pulled off of your face? What's there when you have nothing to relate to? And I wanted that kind of, what's really important to then kind of start to manifest. And I want him to start off from a very selfish point. Like, he's just trying to get back on top. Like, at the beginning of the thing, he's just like, he'd start at the bottom, he works his way to the top, he gets taken away. He's like, oh, I just want to be back on top again. And I just wanted that path of discovery to be like, oh, being on top isn't about the belt. It's not about the adoration. It's not about the money and the fame. It's about being there for the people who got you there. You know what I mean? And that's the thing that I wanted him to like realize is like, like that it wasn't about what he thought it was. I don't want to give too much away, but like I'm trying to think of a good way, but it's just like, getting a success that can't be taken away from him. So like, at the, so, and I think at the end of that, like him doing what he does at the end of that to kind of, to get where he gets it's a victory that can't be taken away. Like, no matter what else happens, and it ends kind of open-ended, right? You see that like, he doesn't vanquish all the bad guys. He's like, they're not in jail or dead or anything. Like, they could all still come after him, but he's in a position now and he's got a success now that is beyond reproach and undeniable. And like, what is that? What does it mean? I guess essentially, like, what intrigued me is like, what does it mean to be the champion? Does it mean to be the best, or does it mean to champion the people that you're the champion of? Like, like, what does it mean? Everybody, like, I think I say it in the book, like, everybody wants to be champion. Nobody wants to champion a group of people. And I think that he realizes that like, no, I'm gonna champion these people and not just be the champion when kind of all is said and done. And it was important to me to kind of like learn that lesson, because I think that a lot of, like, I'm a minority in my country, right? And I think a lot of minorities see the paradigms of success and they go, oh, I want that. And then they get there and they're like, oh, this is just as bad. Like, this is empty because it's not true to who I am. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm a guy who had worked his way up through, from graphic designer through the advertising world to eventually I was a creative director at a job. Like, I had Don Draper's job essentially from LabMan. Like, I had a corner office, I had staff, I had a secretary, and you get there and it's just, sometimes it's not what you want it to be, and I walked away from it. Why? I spent like 6 or 7 years there, and then I was just like, this isn't what I want to do with my life. Like, this isn't I'm not driven to do this. It's just where I ended up because I was kind of good at what I was doing, but it's not it's neither what I wanted to do nor was it who I wanted to be, and I just had to walk away from it. I think that maybe that personal experience was part of what I put in the story, where it's like, I want him to get there. I want him to get what he thinks he wants, just to realize it's not what he needs, and then ultimately figure out what he needs. I hope that answered your question.
No, it's really interesting. And I mean, I don't want to make too much spoilers here, but at a certain point, just because there are so much similarities with the Silver Age comic books, that I expected the brother of the end of the Destiny to come back.
Yes,
I really was looking for it to be toward the end. So the big question is, are you planning about a sequel?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I can talk a little bit about the sequel. So, you see that, and I also wanted, like, that whole brother thing, like, I really wanted to show that you can have two very similar experiences and end up two very different places. And they're all equally valid. Like, I understand, especially in America, like, we have a very pluralistic society here, right? So there's like a lot of different types of people. And I realize in Europe, that's not necessarily the case. Like, you can easily live in a village where you're only amongst your people forever. But in America, you're always kind of brushing up against other types of people. But as a minority in America or in the States, like, we have to fight our fight, right? Because to be a marginalized person, there's a certain amount of fighting your fight that has to happen. And that can, if you fight long enough, you can get very angry, or you can start to, you can let the anger of it consume you. And I think that's a very real danger, right? It's like the mistake struggle for anger is only going to poison your heart, right? But also part of being a minority in this country and where I'm from is that we have to express our beauty. Like, we have to, like, show the thing it is that we're fighting for. Like, it can't all be about struggle. It has to be about, like, celebration of our culture. Like, this is why we're trying to preserve our dignity. And that, and that's the thing about expressing your beauty, is it affords you dignity. It's like a gift you give yourself. Like, you don't need permission to do that. And I think that, the brothers end up being one who's about expressing his beauty, and the other one becomes about, like, fighting his fight in the way to win. Like, he's like, one brother's really just looking to be the winner, right? Like, he just wants to be the general. Like, he saw what like being a man of means and being powerful and being, you know, feared. He sees what that got, and he just wanted that. And then Mano's a guy who goes like, no, I just want there to be no more of those guys. Like I don't want to be one of those guys. I want there to be no more of those guys. So, so moving forward, now that he is where he is, the next series I really want him to get tempted by things that are they're a little softer, right? Like they're a little less clear cut, where it's like Hollywood's going to come calling, or movies are going to start getting made. So there's a lot of elements of metafiction that happen within this series of them. I'm really going to explore this in the next one, where like he's going to be out there kind of like, you know, like, oh, look, you can reach all of these people and, you know, really up your profile if you start making movies. But now he's not in control of that. And he has to, like, he's got script writers, he's got directors, he's got editors. And it's like, you know, he sees these movies after the fact, and it's like, you know, maybe they're not setting an example that he would have set, you know, like, oh, like I thought we were doing this. Like, oh, well, in edit, we changed it to this. And he's like, well, that kind of makes me look not great, you know? So he's trying to, like, he's taking on things that he can't punch his way out of, right? You know, it's kind of like those kind of like softer things. But in that story, like him kind of like let's just say he's being lured by a glitzier lifestyle, right? And then that's starting to dissociate him from his fan base, wherein people are starting to get the wrong idea about him. It's kind of like, in my head, it's like if Superman existed, like what he would think about the Man of Steel. Like would he like watch that next snapping scene and be like, oh man, like people like this? Oh my God, like is that what they think I'm like? Like I need to do something about this, like that kind of thing. But also, in addition to this kind of like, you know, the allure of like of that kind of like, you know, being taken care of, having, you know, people around you just take care of your every need and stuff like that. Like the allure of that and what it might do to him is that's kind of the central driving force of that storyline. But also in that storyline, Ophelia is coming back. The little girl he meets at the store. Yeah. She's going to come back, and she's going to have a problem that he needs to help her solve. And she's going to be the, like, while he's being pulled into this new high profile glitzy lifestyle, he's got this anchor from his past that's come back and knows him as the scared little boy who had no parents, like, you know, that whole thing. So like I wanted this to be like a very centering force in his life, and this very alluring, like, you know, pulling him off into another direction. And so that's the main kind of conflict of that is going to be those differences. Is like, now not only this is someone who knows you, this is someone who knows your real name, this is someone who's seen your real face, like that kind of person in your life, and how they sometimes can bump up against that persona that you've built up, and then the people who are feeding the persona because it makes them money, and that conflict, like those conflicts that happen. And so that's going to be the crux of that. But I'm also going to, in that new series, there's going to be a lot of like metafiction. So we're going to get the comic book adaptation of the movies that he's made in that world. And so those will, like, those free me up to do anything, right? So like the world that he's in now is kind of like very grounded, very down to earth, with the exception of like luchadors being, you know, like sometimes having magical powers, you know, to some weird unstable molecules degree. And I never define it, and I never will. Like I don't ever want to get into like midichlorians, right? Like I'm just going to keep it very like open-ended, unstable molecules kind of stuff. But everything else is just the regular world. Like they still get on planes, they still watch TV, there's still movies, you know, whatever. But the movies I make can be completely fanciful. Like, you know, he's going to make a spy movie, and so it's going to be him as himself, but a spy for like the Mexican Secret Service running a mission in the Middle East and that sort of thing. And then there's also going to be like a sci-fi one where it's like a giant, you know, giant robot fights a giant monster. And then we're going to do like a jungle adventure one. I just did a poster for that recently, you know, where he's out, like, you know, looking for like ancient treasures out in the jungle that may or may not be magic. And then there's going to be like a surf movie one, like, because the surf movies were like really big in the 60s. And so very kind of like, you know, kitschy, almost romantic. But yeah, like I kind of, I don't know about him and romance. Like I want to keep that away from these stories kind of completely, because it kind of doesn't matter, you know. And I also don't want to write a bunch of women characters that are their only job is to be like a love interest, you know. Like I like when Ophelia comes back, she's married to someone else completely. Like she's in a healthy relationship, and they're just going to have a nice mature male female like old friend relationship, because you don't see that enough in comic books. There's always some weird entanglement, and I think that I don't really think of him as having like he's married to wrestling. Like in my head, like Lamano's married to wrestling, and that's just who, you know, and that's all he needs in his life. That's enough for him, you know. So
such a tough relationship.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in one of those metafiction like movies that he makes, I think one of them might have a romantic angle in it, just to kind of showcase that he's not very good at it. That he's really poor. Like, you know, it's just it's like watching Arnold Schwarzenegger like have a relationship in a movie. It's like, it's not what you want from him, you know. Like he's, you know, he needs to like shoot guns and kill bad guys, and like I don't really need to see him be a complex human in that way. So, but yeah, I those are the things that are going to come out in this new series. And so, yeah, I hope that answered your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, of course.
Okay.
No, one thing just about another character, because apart the end of Destiny is my favorite, which is GG. It's interesting because there are three different things there together. He is a failed wrestler, is a father that is not so satisfied about what he did, and he's a trainer.
Yep.
How did you put all these things together? How did you create the backstory for this such interesting character?
Well, I that's a good question. I named him after my grandfather, and I just wanted this. Like, my grandfather was like one of the toughest men I'd ever known in my life, and he was also one of the smallest adult men I had ever seen in my life. Like, you know what I mean? Like, the guy fought in World War II in two different branches of the service. He was in the Navy and he was in the Coast Guard. He ran landing craft in World War II. Like, he was a tough guy, but he was also like 5'3" or something. You know what I mean? So I just like the idea of this like very world weary, capable small man. You know, so that's kind of like visually where he came from, and he like looks kind of like my grandfather in a lot of ways. But then I wanted, like, I like the idea of Jiminy Cricket, and I like those kind of, those Philatides, like all of those characters, like throughout mythology, who show up to help the hero, right? They're part of that hero's journey. But I always wonder, like, how do they get there? Like, how, like, what is their motivation? And I also, so I wanted him to have motivation other than just like, oh, I'm here to stop the bad guy, or I'm here to help you stop the bad guy, or, like, I'm a plot device who showed up just to help you along, to move the story along and deliver exposition. Like, I wanted him to have an interest in this, and I thought that creating that interest, having the backstory that he had, I knew that it had to be personal for him. Like, that was, so then that created that familial tie to, I don't want to spoil too much, but that created the familial tie to that, right? So like, and he had to have a personal interest in like Hefe getting beat, you know what I mean? Because that's going to get him what he wants. So it's like, it's not just about like the greater good. He's like, no, I need this to happen so that this other thing can happen for me. But I also wanted to be super capable and able to pull that off. He's like, look, no, I'm the guy who can help you. Like, finally he has an opportunity to like use what he can do to help get what he wants out of it. And so, yeah, I always felt that like the best trainers and coaches were guys who were never the best at what they did, right? Like, Phil Jackson is a great basketball coach. He wasn't the best NBA player.
Yeah.
But like, and then Michael Jordan was a terrible coach because all Michael Jordan knows how to do is be Michael Jordan. And so he's going to go coach a basketball team, and he's going to talk to these like, 8 guys and be like, oh, just go out there and be Michael Jordan. And they're like, well, no, you're Michael Jordan. We can't do that. Right. So it's the reason that Wayne Gretzky was a terrible hockey coach. It's the reason, like, these guys who are the best at what they do were never good at, like, they never have to think about it because it's so natural to who they are. And so I thought, like, yeah, for him to be an effective coach, I think he needed to be a failed wrestler. But then, as a man, like, I'm a dude who's only 5'6", so I have a lot of like, I'm a small guy in a world where like that's not valued. And so, but it's nothing I can help, right? Like, like I didn't like do a bunch of drugs and I got small. Like, I didn't eat like crap and became small. Like, I was just genetics, man. It's just who I am. And so it's a thing through no fault of my own. I was never going to play football. I was never going to be a basketball player. You know what I mean? Like, it just wasn't in the cards for me. So I think a little bit of that personality kind of got put on Gigi, where he just was like, nothing he did was wrong. In fact, he was really good at what he could do. He just had a hard limit on those things that he could do, but he found a way to make that successful. And I think that him kind of ruining that for himself, like once, like what happens in his life happens, like, he gets to a point where he's not, his eyes aren't out looking for potential troubles. He just thought like, oh, like, I don't want to spoil too much about it, but he just thought like, oh, I'll just, like, everyone's like me. And so these things in my life, these people in my life that are like me will just end up like me, not realizing like, oh no, they're also part, other people, and they could be swayed, and things could go wrong with them. And so he's kind of blindsided by his own focus, and he kind of has to make that right for the right reasons. And so I wanted everybody in this to not just be like evil twirling their mustache bad guys who are like, oh, I'm the bad guy because I'm the bad guy. Like, I wanted them to have personal stakes in it. I mean, Hefe has his reasons, the promoter has his reasons. Like, everybody's got a good, like, oh, I need this to get X, Y, and Z. And none of them are really wrong, at the end of the day. And I kind of wanted that to, sometimes everyone can be in the right, but there's still conflict, because the right thing to do for everybody isn't quite always the same thing. And I think that, the simplicity and the language of this particular style allows for you to hint at a little more complexity under the surface, and you don't have to like, because the story structure itself is also very simple. So it allowed for a lot of like character development because the plot itself is very kind of cut and dry. It's a guy trying to get his mask back. And so, I think that if I had done some like Alan Moore-esque, like all these different subplots are happening here and there, and then, try to develop characters and then also employ this very kind of like unique art style, like I think it would have all just been overwhelming. And so I had to kind of pick and choose where I wanted complexity. And for me, it's always about character. Like I always want people you can empathize with, like, no matter who it is, like, you a good bad guy, you kind of feel sorry for, right? Like you want like, oh yeah, like I can see why, I could have, in the same circumstances, that would have been me, you know what I mean? Like, so, that's how I kind of came up with Gigi. So he's a lot of like personal feeling, familial feelings, but also like in the service of the story, kind of all pushed together and like,
it's really perceived. You feel the life in it. So
thank you.
Really thank for that characters. So just one last question before letting you go, because it's typical for the format. What are the latest graphic novel or books that you have read or that you are reading right now?
Oh, that's a good question. I read a lot of like old stuff. Like I'm trying to think what I have over here. So I'm rereading Scott Morse's Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, because I read that when I was like 15, and like I think I appreciated a lot of it, and then I do quote it a lot, and I read sections of it in my lifetime, but I realized a little while ago that a lot of my art theory was just kind of like this ad hoc assemblage of notions I got, because I went to like, the High School of the Arts, and then I went to graphic design school, and then I've like learned a lot on the job and my time in advertising. And so I just kind of like, over the past couple of years, I've been kind of like interrogating my own artistic senses, like kind of like what I view to be like the tenets of what I do, just to kind of see if they still make sense and still hold water. So I'm rereading that. I just got the Squadron Supreme miniseries from the 80s. I've been rereading that. And then I just got the Mike Mignola Cosmic Odyssey that he did for DC. And I'm rereading that. So I'm like, I really just kind of like read a lot of like old stuff. I just got the hold on a sec. I just got the Jaime Hernandez wrestling book with all those like wrestling drawings in it. Yeah. I've been reading that as well. And then doing a lot of research in a lot of weird areas for the new series of Lamano. Like so I'm like, I've been watching a lot of like old action adventure movies, old surfing movies, just to kind of like see like, what the tropes are. And again, I want all of those things to like feel like right. You know what I mean? So if I do a spy movie that's set in the 60s, I want it to like feel like an old spy movie set in the 60s with like kind of my take on it. So I've been doing a little bit of that, kind of like delving into like, some James Bond novels stuff, just to kind of like see, I kind of wanted to see like what Fleming did versus what got made into a movie kind of things, just kind of, see where there might be kind of discourse there. But and then I have another project I'm working on that I can't talk about that it required a little bit of research. Like really right now, I'm just kind of like rereading old stuff and then doing research for new stuff that I can't talk about. So, but none of it's really, I mean, the old stuff is for fun. The research is obviously for work coming up, but yeah.
It's even in this book, we can feel that there is a lot of research, because we have seen the notes on the end of the books that are fantastic, because after you read the story, you can read all the backstories, all the information about the design that it's very, very exceptional. It's good to read about
thank you.
that. So
I just wanted to again, I don't want to get anything wrong, because I'm setting it in a time period and like there's like you can fact check all of this, so I want to make sure that like I got everything, like every T is crossed, every I is dotted. Like, I want to make sure everything's in place, so no one can come to me and go, oh, actually, like, I mean, there are a couple of those I'm sure in there, but like I just want to make sure, comic fans, we talked about it earlier. Like, I just want to hear about it. So. Yeah.
So Jasmine, really thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and I really do hope to see you in Italy somehow, somewhere.
Yeah, well,
so it would be very good.
Yeah, hopefully the book does well enough that you guys it warrants me coming out there. So yeah, everyone watching, go buy a copy of Lamano. It's out Monday or Tuesday, isn't it? Like coming up soon. Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. 5 days from now. Yeah.
All right. Excellent.
So, thank you for your time. Enjoy your next exhibition in New York, and really, really thank you again for being here.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Grazie a chiunque ci ha seguito questa sera, è stato veramente un piacere. Naturalmente ci vediamo con la puntata di domani e come al solito a presto. Ciao a tutti. Hello Jason, bye bye.
Bye.